Hey everybody, this is Ron, and this week we had a conversation with film critic Jonathan Rosenbaum, as well as one of his students, Vida Zelic. We were talking about the movie Enchanted Desna, a 1964 film by Yulia Solntseva, about her husband, who had passed away, the filmmaker Alexander Dovzhenko. It's about his life. It was actually written by him, and she made the film about him. But the conversation started before we actually started. So I hit record, and so this episode is starting in the middle of a conversation. But I promise you didn't miss that much. I hit record pretty quickly. Anyways, here we are as Dan and I interview Jonathan Rosenbaum and one of his students, Vida Zelic.
It's saying that, that it's basically praising what the visuals and the cinematic inventiveness, but criticizing them ideologically, I guess you could say, or politically. That there's a certain kind of and also seeing the kind of the terminology of the sort of utopian view of the world as being kind of biblical in a way. At least
yeah, I was going to say,
but yeah.
Oh god, there's something early in the film that seemed like a reference to when he picks the carrot. I thought that seemed a lot like that part in St. Augustine's Confessions where he's talking about he steals the apple and then he feels really guilty about it, and then he's kind of
interesting. I never thought of that, but yeah.
And I mean it seemed like kind of like the idea that and I'm probably going to mispronounce his name a few more times over the course of Dovzhenko.
Yeah.
Dovzhenko. I mean, it seems like plausible he would have read Augustine's Confessions at some point.
I would think so. Yeah. One thing I want to mention that I think is sort of like one reason why I wanted to assign this film, apart from the fact that I love it, is that I thought it presented interesting challenges because we know so little about, I think, how this film came to be made. And, because it was something that Dovzhenko wanted to do, but shortly after he died, his widow suddenly was able to do, well, the first in a trilogy of the films that he wanted to do. And then the third in the trilogy was The Enchanted Desna. The first was Poem of the Sea, and the second was called, I think, The Years of Fire, or it's known as sometimes, or something like Years of Fire. And Enchanted Desna is, to me, the best of the three. One thing that I love,
I should do the intro.
I'm sorry?
I should do the intro quick if we're ready to go.
Yeah.
So what about the intro? I'm sorry.
I just got to do it quick.
I've been recording because I didn't want to miss anything here because the discussion started. So.
Hey, everybody, this is Dan.
And this is Ron.
And this is the Anomaly Movies podcast. We thought we had one special guest. It turns out we have multiple special guests today. I'm very excited about this. We got Jonathan Rosenbaum, the legendary film critic, and some of his students, right now, one of his students. We might have some more jumping on the call. Right now, we have please forgive me if I mispronounce your name, but Vida Zelic.
Zelic, yeah.
Zelic, okay.
Yeah, you got it right.
And today we're talking about a great Ukrainian film that I had never heard of. I sent Jonathan a message and I was like, what's a movie you want to talk about that probably we haven't heard of? And he said, The Enchanted Desna. Never heard of it. I looked it up. It's gorgeous. It's got a lot of very interesting tonal shifts. It goes from being a nostalgic film about childhood to kind of a bitter film about war. There's a part in the middle with two talking horses that's the kind of bleak existential episode of Mr. Ed that I never knew I needed in my life before now, but now I can't imagine living without it. And so, thanks for coming on and welcome onto the program.
Thank you. I should mention, by the way, for those of you who haven't seen any of the films of Alexander Dovzhenko, who most of which the best known are silent, but there are a couple of wonderful sound films too, at least a couple. Is that they're actually talking horses in some of his silent films too. I think especially Arsenal.
Oh wait, yeah, in Earth. I think there's a talking horse at some
Might
point.
be. It's the funny thing, quite by coincidence, Godard gave this wonderful interview with with an Indian film critic just a couple of days ago. And one of the things he cited as a film that he wanted everybody to see was Arsenal of Dovzhenko. I mean, to me, Dovzhenko, if I had to name, like the 10 or maybe even the 5 greatest of all filmmakers, he would be on the list. He's neglected for many reasons, but one of the things I want to mention first to tell you the little I know about his widow, who's no longer alive too. She died, although just by chance, I actually met her briefly in London in the mid-70s. We didn't really have a conversation because she didn't speak any English and I didn't speak any Russian or Ukrainian. She was Russian, actually, not Ukrainian. But there's a famous science fiction film that was made in the silent period in Russia. I'm trying to remember the name of it, but it was Aita, it's called, Queen of Mars. And she was the star. She actually played the lead role in it. She also played a small role, I think, in Earth, but she married Dovzhenko. The thing that I just learned recently, and this is very startling and it's hard to know how to process it, but it's, the same way that in the United States, it's sort of revealed, somehow you can get people's FBI files and things like this in the United States. Well, they revealed the fact that she had been a member of the KGB. And what's really interesting about that is one also knows, I know from having read the few, things in English about Dovzhenko, there's a book about him, and which really emphasizes the fact that he was under surveillance by the Russian government for practically his entire life because he was a Ukrainian partisan and an activist and was considered very suspicious for this reason. And it's an attitude that even continues to today, that kind of some of the feelings against.
Well, I guess it's a glass half full, half empty thing, right? Because you can use the state as kind of a dating service.
Well, I don't know, but it does seem to me that one reason why Julia Sontseva, or one possible reason why she joined the KGB, was to protect her husband. But the other thing the mystery that I've always wondered about, I first saw Enchanted Desna at the Cinematheque in Paris, where they would show it on a regular basis. By the way, it's in 70 millimeter in stereophonic sound. So we would see it in 70 millimeter, but without any subtitles. So we never could understand what people were saying, but it was still a kind of breathtaking movie. But in any case, I was going to say that she might have done it, as I say, to protect Dovzhenko, but it's also worth pointing out that this is a very expensive film, it looks like. She had a lot of resources to draw upon.
Oh, yeah, she burned down a whole village.
Yeah. The fact that she was a member of the KGB might have helped her get that budget, It seems to me that there are a lot of mysteries that we're probably never going to be able to solve about all of this, but it does seem to me that's significant and interesting to learn that. And I learned it just from talking to a great Russian filmmaker named Sergei Lozinska. I don't even know how to pronounce his name, who's Latvian actually. But I was at a festival and when I was talking about Sontseva, he told me he had just read this and, in Pravda, so that's a kind of a fascinating fact. And it's kind of interesting when you consider the fact that the whole last chapter of Dovzhenko's career is quite horrific when you think about the fact that he wanted to make all these films and couldn't do any of them. And in fact, the first color film that he worked on, which was, it's called a Dovzhenko film, but he actually was so unhappy with the changes that Stalin insisted on that he removed his name from the film. And it's credited to Sontseva as being the director, actually.
Was there a USSR equivalent of like Alan Smithy, or is it just there's no name on the movie?
Well, in this case, it's Sontseva who signed the film as being the director, and she may have been, assistant director, I don't know. There is a kind of equivalent to Alan Smithy, because another favorite filmmaker of mine who just died recently in her 80s, Kira Muratova, who is kind of like an amazing, who was also Ukrainian, but also Jewish. There was one film of hers, which I like actually, and I don't know what the interference was, but she was so unhappy with the censorship changes that she assigned the credit of the film as director to a Russian equivalent of Alan Smithy. You know, so it's, I can't remember the name, but it's like they do have an equivalent to Smithy, actually. But in any case, after that, the last film that Dovzhenko worked on, this is really pathetic, is a piece of anti-American propaganda that is so bad. I mean, it's bad as filmmaking, it's hokey, it's melodramatic. It doesn't look anything like Dovzhenko from what we know of Dovzhenko. So it was something he was doing according to, I don't know, following orders or whatever. But the thing is, the reason why the film was never finished is that the Russian government shut off the electricity at the studio. So literally, the film, and you know, the film exists where they've sort of like a kind of a documentary that goes with it that talked about it, you know, so it's about 40 minutes were filmed or something, and it's awful. It's so awful that you really think that it's almost better that it was never finished, you know. So it seems to me, I mean, a lot of course, Russian filmmakers suffered a lot from censorship, and the only one who triumphed, in my opinion, indirectly is Eisenstein, because he made his most daring and remarkable film, in my opinion, Ivan the Terrible, Part 2. You know, even though it was banned for many years, it was a real act of courage in which he was able to, he somehow figured out ways of doing what he wanted to do, even though it was years before they would even show it in Russia. Yeah. And at the time it originally was released in the West, everybody thought it was a work that was totally compromised by, you know, Russian interference and Stalin and all of this, when in fact it's quite different from that, as we know now from certain scholars of, you know, Russian cinema. So that's a whole complicated other story. So but yeah, sorry.
Was Enchanted Desna ever released in the United States, or was it only shown around Europe with no subtitles?
No, it was shown with subtitles. I think it had a brief commercial run, because Jean-Luc Godard actually listed it as #1 on his 10 best list in 1965. Yeah. So for him, it was the best film that he saw anywhere in 1965. So I think it had a brief run. It probably showed at Cannes. Sontsiva, I don't know if it was for this film, it might have been the previous one, was the first woman filmmaker who ever was sort of like received a prize at a film festival at Cannes, you know, a year or two before that with, I think, Years of Fire. So she was getting to be a bit known. I don't think this film, because of the Cold War and other reasons, was not shown at all in the States. However, a few years ago, because I had written about these films briefly, a very enterprising graduate student in film managed to find a way of getting a hold of prints of the film and showed them in Queens, New York, all 3 of the trilogy, including showing Enchanted Desna in 70 millimeter, and flew me in so I could give an introduction, and it was quite a wonderful event. And the interesting thing is that it's a kind of, it's really perverse, but they released a box set of all of Dovzhenko's work, and it was only, if I recall correctly, something like only a dozen copies were made, and it was made only for Ukrainian diplomats, actually. But somebody managed to get a hold of one of them and released it on various pirate sites. And you know, the 3 Sontsiva films are actually more than 3 that are based on Dovzhenko, that have, but like 4 or 5 maybe.
And that's probably where the YouTube copy came from?
Yeah, I assume so. But it's like the same, I believe the same good copy that, you know, because there was my friend who started this series at Museum of the Moving Image in Queens, you know, posted them on, you know, his Vimeo links too. So I don't know if you can get all 3 of them, but I think if you hunt around on the internet, you can probably find them. So yeah, they're kind of amazing, but I don't know if they've ever, I don't really know anything about their kind of commercial fate and how they were received in Russia. I mean, I really don't, except that, it's in Russian, it's not in Ukrainian, I think, and that's probably, significant in the sense that it's on a Ukrainian subject, but still, he was in exile, of course, from Ukraine for a good part of his life, and he wanted to go back to Ukraine, but was not allowed to. Mm-hmm. Because he had his ups and downs with Stalin. I mean,
that probably informed some of the nostalgia in the beginning of the film, I would guess, like the inability to return home.
Well, yeah, there was that. And there's also what's really significant. I mean, he only talks about this a little bit, but I think he had something like 13 or 14 siblings, and all but one of them died. I mean, it was that poor a family. He had one sister who survived and I think became a doctor or something.
Oh,
but
yeah,
it was like all of his siblings died of starvation or diseases or things like that, And
there's that scene earlier in the film where he's just like, all my brothers are dead, and then he kind of drops it like a hot potato.
Yeah, and he actually had a whole other career before he became a filmmaker, in which he was a school teacher, actually. Oh. And he was apparently the first one of his family who actually went to school, I think, or something like that. I don't know, in terms of all the details. But, and he had other careers too. He worked for a long time as a political cartoonist, for example.
Oh, I did not know that.
Yeah. And there's a kind of a quality like cartoons, in some of the caricatures of some of the characters, you could see him like a cartoonist.
Are there any collections of the cartoons out there?
No, but on YouTube, the next thing that appears is a kind of a rough translation of a Ukrainian documentary about Dovzhenko. It leaves out actually in some ways my favorite of all of his films. It's it's not adequate, but my favorite of his films is his first sound film, Ivan. Which for some reason it doesn't even mention, but usually the only ones that people have hear about is Earth. That's the one that gets most.
That's the only one I ever saw. Yeah.
But if you go looking for them, you could find others, including his first film, which is I haven't seen all of his films still. They're very tricky. Or I've seen them, but I don't always remember them. There's something about a diplomatic pouch, which he made before his better known films. And then he made Zvenigora, which was the first one that had a kind of international success, which is a very difficult, dense film in a lot of ways. And then came Arsenal, then came Earth, then came Ivan, then came Erograd. Now, Erograd is a film that also went by the name of Frontier. Two of the biggest fans of Erograd, which did play in the United States, were Ilya Kazan, who actually always counted the film as one of the major influences on his own work. And the other was James Agee really loved it. Although James Agee knew so little about Dovzhenko that when he was trying to pitch the idea of a cover story on Eisenstein, he said, Eisenstein has had nothing but troubles with the Russian authorities, unlike Dovzhenko, who hasn't had any troubles, which of course is absurd. I mean, Dovzhenko had more troubles but I mean, that's how little Agee knew about it, you know. And I think because of the Cold War, where we were very slow, and we're still slow in being able to understand a lot that went on, It's unfortunate that the only book that exists, or maybe there are two books on Dovzhenko, but they're both all about politics. They're not about aesthetics at all, which is kind of frustrating because it seems to me that aesthetically he's really amazing. It's like
there's never been a book-length treatise on the aesthetics of Dovzhenko. That's surprising.
Well, no, I wouldn't say. I mean, I'm talking about in English.
Oh, in English, okay.
Yeah. I mean, there are several books on Dovzhenko in French. I'm sure there are books on him in other languages too, and probably quite a few in Russian and maybe Ukrainian too. But he was also a poet, by the way, too. But I don't know anything. I don't know if I've ever seen any of his poems. But he kind of one of the things that I find most moving in the film that's really interesting is when he talks about the lion. And then he basically says, he kind of hints at the fact that he's sort of made up, that it's his imagination, that there wasn't really a lion. It's sort of like, like on the banks of the Desna. But he'd like to prefer that, he'd like to imagine that there was. And that the whole way, in a way, this whole film is a certain type of magical realism. At least a lot of the kind of, there's a sense of exaggeration.
Oh yeah, it seems like there's a lot of stuff about the nature of memory on top of whatever, like almost, it's almost more about the nature of memory than it's about like the specifics of growing up in that area or serving in World War II.
Yeah, and of course it's also very strange in the sense that you have different actors playing him at different ages, and there's not a, you kind of you can assume a kind of through line, but it does seem like almost different people at different ages too.
Yeah, and I feel like that's been done in a few other films where they want to have like a giant time jump. Like the most recent one I can think of was Moonlight. They did that. They had 3 separate for the 3 different periods of the person's life. But I guess they did it in the Ukraine first.
Well, I don't know. Anyways, there's also Terrence Davies, which is an important, I think, a kind of nostalgia. So for my student, I want to ask you: have you been able to write anything yet, or have you? Are you still working on it?
Yeah, I'm still working on it because I watched it sort of not knowing anything about the context of in the context in which it was made. So I'm I'm still deciding on whether to focus on it purely aesthetically or to include this political aspect.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the reasons why I picked it was precisely because of that, because what I've told you already is just about everything I know about the film. I know that I know practically nothing. And it presents interesting challenges that way in terms of trying to find out, or trying to come to terms with it on the basis of not knowing, like how the film got financed, how it got made, whether there were pressures on Sonsiva to alter things or not, and to whether it, there is a version of the text that it was based on, which was published as a text, not exactly as a screenplay, but you can find a book called The Enchanted Desna in English. But it's, whether he wrote it as that text or whether he wrote it as a screenplay, I don't even know that. So what is kind of remarkable about the film is that there are not many expensive films like that seem to have been made as if it were made, like in 16 millimeter by an independent filmmaker, where someone is running around with a camera and doing, backflips and, all of these kinds of, the kind of freedom that you associate with, experimental cinema and
70 millimeter film wasn't, 70 millimeter film still isn't cheap.
No.
To do anything with.
This is the only one, I think, of the, at least to my knowledge, that Sonsiva made that was in 70 millimeter. There's another film after the 3, including that came after Enchanted Desna, which is called Golden Gates or Golden Gate, which is a kind of celebration of Dovzhenko with clips from his film. One thing that's off-putting, though, is that the film is I may have been 70 millimeter, but it's in widescreen. And the clips from his films are actually, it's not letterbox. She doesn't respect the aspect ratio, the things she takes clips from, which is kind of unnerving. But again, who knows if she was the one who decided that, or maybe the Russian distributor decided. There are all these things we don't know. And, when I met her, the one time I met her, I wish I could have talked to her. But the fact, as I say, that she didn't speak English and I didn't speak Russian or Ukrainian just meant that it was just exchanging hellos, and that was it.
And the fact that you were going to see movies without any subtitles in the 60s is kind of like blowing my mind.
Well, the reason why is partly had to do with the fact that this was, it was a kind of crazy decision, but a policy of Henri Langlois that not only would he show films without subtitles, but when there were silent films with intertitles, if he could show them without the intertitles, what they call flash titles, which means they appear on the screen so quickly you can't even read them. He would prefer to do that. He had this theory, that cinema is a visual medium and who cares what the characters are saying or but I mean, you couldn't follow the films, It's like, and I mean, you could appreciate certain things, but in terms of the plots and in terms of understanding what they were doing, I mean, I went with a friend who'd spent time in Russia who told me that, that there's some Stalinist propaganda in this film. But, that's all I knew. And I didn't know what kind of Stalinist propaganda it was. And so, yeah, it's a problem, but I also thought I don't think it was, in other words, I think Langlois was wrong about that. He also was wrong about the fact that he wouldn't show silent films with musical accompaniment, because these were films that were designed to have musical accompaniment.
Like none of them?
None of them, no,
like
never.
Not just Passionate Joan of Arc, but like you're watching like Buster Keaton with no music?
Yeah, that's right.
Wow.
And it was, again, a kind of purist point of view that, one could debate, and I did debate, and a lot of people complained, including me, about it. But it may have had to do partly with the fact that, there's so many issues that would be raised if you do have music, because like what's better, what's worse? Do you try to get the original scores? If you can't, what kind do you use? Because, bad music is worse than no music at all with some of these silent films. And I've seen music with Buster Keaton that's so inattentive to the rhythms, the visual rhythms, that it virtually destroys, like what's good about the film. It's not a simple, these are not problems with simple solutions.
What would you say is the worst accompaniment you ever saw to a silent film? I'm kind of curious.
I'm sorry?
What would you say is the worst musical accompaniment you ever saw with a silent film, or like the most?
I remember that. There was that I saw, which was actually at a leading art cinema in London with Buster Keaton. But there was also, I think, I know a lot of people who love, in fact, a lot of young people love these kind of industrial music that goes with silent films. That's totally anachronistic. It has nothing to do with the way people were seeing the films at that time. And I really hate those type of scores, even though a lot of people like them, because it seems to me that it automatically removes you from the period, and puts you somewhere else. And I think it's very important to kind of get a sense of when it was made and how other people were seeing the film when it was made and so on. So I don't know. I think there are a lot of ways you could screw up a film, with the music. And, Langlois, I mean, the one thing that Langlois did, you see, which nobody else did as a programmer, and this is what made him great. This is what, when we talk about what produced the French New Wave, people are always saying, it was Cahiers du Cinéma, it was the critics there. But the critics were inspired by Langlois more than anybody else, because Langlois is somebody who would program all kinds of films together so that they rub shoulders with each other. So you would have an Otto Preminger film, followed by a Kenji Mizoguchi film, followed by, a Charlie Chaplin film. And the point is it was almost like all these filmmakers were sitting at the same table together, as if they were having a conversation. And that's that attitude towards these filmmakers of cinema, speaking to cinema, was something that was a basic factor in the French New Wave. And it came from Langlois. It came from that way of programming films, which nobody else was doing. So I think, and that was the first generation of filmmakers who really, in a deep way, were reflecting on film history in certain ways. And, it's very particularly apparent in the early films of Truffaut, as well as Godard and Rivette too. I mean, Rivette had a clip from Metropolis in his first feature, for example.
Right, you have some of the earliest kind of sampling almost in those movies, I feel
sampling, but also critical reflection, because you see what the difference between the way the French New Wave or the better directors would use clips and so on is they would make they had critical insights into these movies. Whereas when you get, an homage to a Howard Hawks movie and a Peter Bogdanovich film or a Martin Scorsese film or, there's a lot of that in America. It's not critical commentary. It's almost like saying, it's, or like, when Paul Schrader gives you the plot of large portions of the plot of The Searchers in Taxi Driver, for example. I mean, he's not giving you a real critical commentary on The Searchers. He's just reproducing certain things.
He's kind of using it like a theme to extrapolate on other things, or sort of a.
Well, it almost becomes like a kind of real estate, like I own this property, because I'm quoting from it. It just seems to me, it's really funny because I heard a story once that Paul Schrader went up to Godard at Telluride, festival I've never been to, and he said, I just want you to know that I took something from your film La Femme Mariée and used it in, I don't know, American Gigolo. And Godard said, it doesn't matter what you take. What matters is where you take it to. And I think that that's the difference, in other words, between the way the Americans would cite things and the way and when the French did it, it was, to me, not in every case, because sometimes they would cite things the same way the Americans did. But it's like, or when Woody Allen, imitates Bergman or Fellini or,
right.
Or Warren Beatty, in Reds, it's like, it just seems to me there's a kind of copycat thing, which is quite different from what was known as the homage, because they were critical homages that, well, I mean, a perfect example, what Godard would do is he would, in Weekend, he has a scene that actually combines one of the murders in Weekend, combines a shot from Psycho with a shot from Monsieur Verdoux. And those are both movies about murder equated with capitalism. It's like, that's what he's making a comment on. But if you just sort of like if you just reproduce the shot from Psycho without doing anything else, you're not making a comment about capitalism. You're making a comment about, I don't know, Hitchcock or about yourself.
You're kind of saying I saw Psycho, right? Like I think the most egregious example of that is like the end of the first Star Wars movie, where you have that almost exact lift from Triumph of the Will, but it doesn't seem to know what the hell it's doing with it.
Yeah, that's right. Except that you could talk about it being, I mean, I regard in certain ways Star Wars as a fascist film, but not in the same way, obviously, as Triumph of the Will. But it's still a film that convinced people that you could have something like a bloodless war. And like, I blame Star Wars on helping to create let's say, a public atmosphere for the Gulf Wars, because people thought, oh, it's really neat if we have, these Gulf Wars, because it's like a video game, it's not, which is a whole attitude that Star Wars helped to promote, where you don't see the blood anymore.
Right.
Whereas it seemed to me earlier wars, you were much
no
more aware of the blood. Now, of course, with drones, you're even less aware of, the personal gore. So, anyway, I do think it's important. And, when Godard said that when he made, basically, when he made films, it was another way of writing criticism. And when he wrote criticism, it was another way of making cinema. I think that's important. It's also important, and it's a radical position, but one that I happen to share, which is that film criticism is an art form, where it seems to me a lot of what my colleagues feel, even very respectable colleagues, is that what I should be as a film critic is a parasite, that's what film critics should be. It's sort of like artists are, the superior beings, and film critics are inferior beings who sort of feed on the artists. And, I'm not trying to say that never happens, but the point is you can do more with that profession than simply be a parasite. And it seems to me that what I try to do is start a kind of public, or not even start, but add to or affect or influence a public discussion about a film. And when you're doing that, it becomes, it's a social activity. And as a social activity can be, it can be an art form. Doesn't mean that it necessarily is all the time, but that it can be.
And I think when I first found your writing, that was probably when I was like first getting into college. That was one of the things that struck me the most, was that you were so vehemently opposed to the idea of film criticism as essentially being like a Consumer Reports for movies. Like, is
right.
it,
Although I had to do that. In other words, it was expected of me, and I had to do that to a large extent when my 20 years at the Chicago Reader. But the funny thing is, the consequence of having done that for 20 years is a lot of the times now, when people ask me what I think of a particular film, I have to look it up on my website to even find out whether I still remember it or whether I reviewed it. And then sometimes even after I read the review, I still don't remember the film. Because the part of the trick of being a consumer guide is not just remembering a lot, but forgetting a lot. You have to make what happens each week seem important. And in order to make it seem important, you have to forget what you thought, what you were pretending was important the previous week. So it's like you're constantly having to make room, just like, for this week's offerings, And so I think there's something kind of creepy, and it's why I was very happy to, even though I had a wonderful job at the Chicago Reader, and I felt I was really lucky because I had perks that nobody else has ever had. Like I had unlimited length, which I don't know any other critic who's ever had that.
Oh, so like no word count.
That's right. Basically, I mean, they said theoretically, if they thought something was too long, they could cut it. But at the same time, that was the only restriction. It wasn't like that they said, we can't print this because it's too long. Yeah. I mean, when I turned in I think the longest review I ever did, which was one of my best reviews, I think, of Alan René's Malo, the editor of the paper said, this is awfully long. I think it was 22 type pages. So we're not going to be happy if you do something like this every week, but this case will print it all, So it was like I was testing the limits, and I wasn't being censored, Whereas it seems to me, even if you were writing for the New York Times, if you're writing for the New Yorker, you would be cut by length. And not only that, but I've come to feel this way, which I didn't feel before, but that when you write for a big name mainstream publication like the New York Times or the New Yorker or Time Magazine, it's the aura of the publication that largely dictates how people read you. So the point is, when you write for them, they brand you. But if you actually write for a smaller, let's say if you're a cult writer and just writer for a smaller group of people, then you can brand yourself. So the fact, in other words, that I could say that I'm an artist is possible. I can get away with it because I'm not writing for the New Yorker or the New York Times. But if I were writing for them, they would say, how pretentious can you get? I mean, it's like, because I mean, it's the reason, the very fact that you were reading you is because you're in the New Yorker, not because you're you, but because you're in the New Yorker. And so the one time I wrote something for the New York Times, commissioned, I had to rewrite it several times to please the editor, and a lot of people hated the piece. It was obituary for Ingmar Bergman when he died. And they wanted it to be negative, but I wanted to make it more positive than the editor wanted me to make it. So I was putting in things about his reputation as a great theater director, and he cut them out. It's like, so it was very unsatisfying to me.
Oh yeah, because the final pieces it kind of reads like, and this is, this probably comes down to the editor, but it's just sort of like, I wanted to write about Carl Dreyer, but I'm writing about Ingmar Bergman.
Well, there was some of that, yeah, because I was sort of complaining about the fact that people preferred Bergman because he was simpler. It's just like, why do some people, I don't know, maybe it's totally unfair. I was going to say, why do some Americans prefer Donald Trump to Joe Biden? Because they hate complexity. It's like, Trump is simpler, making things simpler, making the world look simpler. And Bergman makes the world look a lot simpler than Carl Dreyer does.
For sure.
But that's not I think that's probably an oversimplification too, because also Bergman had a lot of real skills and was terrific with actors and a lot of things, and it's like.
Do you ever look back at the essays or the critique that you've provided in the past? So putting that aside, where it was so heavily edited or going back and forth, that you've looked back on and said, I don't know what I was thinking.
Well, yeah, sure. And in fact, there's a lot of pieces that I repost on my website, which I don't agree with anymore, and which could have just as well written by somebody else. So sure, I do that. I mean, the one thing that's great about for me about the website, though, is if I want to change something I wrote, I can. I have total control over it, even though the Chicago Reader technically owns all the pieces I wrote for them. It just happened when, the funny thing was, when I was offered a website when I retired, at the time, I wasn't even sure I wanted a website because I didn't know what it involved, you know? So it was sort of like, because I wasn't sure whether I wanted it, I sort of, you know, almost said, okay, I only want it if I have total editorial control over it. And the editor, the editor of the Reader didn't want to give me total control, but the owners of the Reader decided in my favor. And of course, it was a real gift, an incredible gift, because I think my reputation, such as it is now, largely derives from having a website. But I didn't understand that at the time, you know, but because maybe it's because websites were getting started. I don't know. I hadn't really graduated. I wasn't, you know, like I didn't have the same kind of presence on Facebook or Twitter then. It was a whole different world for me. So I've kind of, you know, grown into it, you know, I guess in some ways. And I'm very lucky. But it means that there are not that many times it's happened, but a few times, if I still have the original draft that I wrote of an article that, you know, and I didn't like the version it was published as, I can go back to my original draft and have that on the site.
Yeah, and I think the website definitely was a huge part when I initially found your writing. The fact that it seems, at least when you're 20 years old, it seems like you probably wrote at least a paragraph about seemingly every movie that ever existed. And so it'd be like, I take some movies out of the library, I check what you had to say, I check what Dennis Grunes had to say, and a few other people, and it was...
Who was it, Dennis?
Oh, Dennis Grunes. He was running a blog. He was... I don't know if he was ever employed by anybody. The essays are great. He wrote these like great short kind of. He's a little bit closer to like David Thompson. There's some stuff where he's kind of talking about himself personally through the film, I guess. But
I have to say, I have a lot of issues with David Thompson. That's partly because he makes things up. In other words,
oh, I didn't know that.
There's a quality of a certain kind of English journalist who can have something to say on any subject. You know, it's sort of like, and it can sound knowledgeable. But, you know, if you look at, I mean, what really infuriated me was his, which is a very popular book on Orson Welles called Rosebud, in which there are literally mistakes on every page because he just made stuff up. But he does that, for example, in his biographical dictionary, The Cinema. There's a film I happen to like a lot, a Spanish film that's not too well known in the United States, that's called Calle Royale, which means Main Street, actually. And it actually has an American actress in it, Betsy Blair. And it was made by a communist. It's a very complicated film, but it's one of the greatest Spanish films. And you look up David Thompson on it, who hasn't seen it, obviously, and he says it's an adaptation of Sinclair Lewis's Main Street, which is ridiculous. It's not even close. But, you know, he figures, well, nobody's going to check me on this, so why not, you know? I guess. I don't know how he doesn't go back and correct these things either, you know. Just neither. What?
The thing I always liked about his stuff was you never knew what to expect. Like there's that biography of Nicole Kidman where half of it is just him like, I wish she was in this movie. And it's just like, it goes completely off the rails. And there's something kind of fun about seeing something go so completely off the rails to me.
I started out as a fan of his stuff, and he's got a certain intelligence. He's got qualities as a writer. I just think as a film historian and a person who's considered an expert, on that level alone, not on any other, he's a disgrace. You know, it's like to me, it's like, but you have to catch him out at these things to know that he's doing it. And most people don't. So they think, you know, he's like, on the one hand, people who don't know about Orson Welles consider him an expert on Orson Welles. People who are Welles scholars he never gets invited to Wells conferences because, I mean, they know he doesn't know anything, you know, but it's like the rest of the people consider him the expert. And the reason why his book on Wells is so popular is that it's anti-Wells. You know, that America is the only country where Wells is really hated by a lot of people. And, you know, they say Citizen Kane is good, but everything else is bad or whatever, you know, because he's an ideological threat in some kind of way. And it seems to me that David Thompson is ultimately a supporter of the status quo, even though, you know, he once said that, you know, the greatest film since Citizen Kane was Celine and Julie Go Boating. So he's unpredictable, you know, and I can agree with him about certain things, but I just find that it's that kind of ease that he has of sort of like creating a patter about any subject becomes suspect if it starts.
It's entertainment. It's not quite so much scholarship.
Yeah, he's not a scholar. He's not even remotely a scholar. But I think it's. But he can sometimes be a good critic. It's true. I mean, I don't usually go to him for insight into films because, you see, one of the things, when he had a column in Esquire on film for a while in which he would alternate between saying it's the end of cinema's not an art form anymore, it's hopeless, and then something would come along like The Truman Show and he'd say, oh, cinema's reborn, you know, it's a great film.
That's the
reborn. And then the next week he would go back to saying it's, you know, like cinema's collapsed, it's because it's whatever people want to hear at any given moment. He's there to provide it, you know. It's like or whatever the industry wants in any given moment too. So I think that he's much too accommodating, you know, I think to sort of like mainstream biases and tastes, you know. And he's very good. I mean, to be able to know what people want to hear at any given moment is a certain talent too, I suppose. It's what the filmmakers had too, you know, but
yeah. Anyway. I think one of the things I really liked about Dennis Gruen's webpage with all the short reviews was he wasn't pretending to be a scholar. It was pretty much entirely aesthetics and historical context analysis.
Yeah.
And also just the fact that he basically wasn't employed by anybody and he was still churning out like 5 reviews a day, it seemed like, until he died. I don't know how he was doing it. There's a lot of great stuff on there, but
well, that's important too, because
knew him and he told me about him, and apparently he was just like living in a house. He had like severe diabetes, and all he would do was just write about movies from memory all day, which I don't know how you can have that kind of memory, but I was always pretty impressed by it.
Well, one of the things that I mean, the idea of not being in the power game is important in a way, because one of the things that, even though I started out as a fan of Pauline Kael and I admired her in some ways as a writer, she was too interested in power. And it seems to me that once you become interested in power, you become less interesting. Mm-hmm. Power is not to me, is not a fascinating subject. And it becomes important in a way outside of what you're reading about, you know, and almost like, you know, who is placed where and who is on, you know. It just seems to me that a lot of writers are really, you can divide writers almost between those who are kind of obsessed with power and power positions and those who aren't. And I find often that the critics who I like the most, which would include, I don't know, I guess Adrian Martin, who's in Australia, Chris Fujiwara, who's actually based in Japan now, but is American, is, you know, someone based in power. I mean, but I guess you can be interested in power too. I mean, of someone else who's an incredible critic, but he's never been translated into English, at least any of his books, is a Japanese critic named Shigehiko Hasumi. And he's somebody who takes what's so fascinating about him is I actually read one book by him about Ozu in French. And my French is not great, but I went to the trouble of even using a dictionary to read it. And it's a short book. And the incredible thing about his book on Ozu is it takes the reverse position of everything that's said in the West about Ozu. Like Ozu, you know, you read Donald Ritchie, and Donald Ritchie says Ozu is the most Japanese of Japanese directors. Yeah. And Hasumi says he's the least Japanese of Japanese filmmakers. Why? Because the weather in all of his films is the weather of Southern California, not the weather of Japan. It's raining all the time in Japan. And Ozu spent much of his life watching American films. He loved American films. He was like, his favorite movie was Citizen Kane, actually. And when he saw Fantasia, he said, "That's why we lost the war." He would say things like this. So, and he's interesting in all sorts of other ways too. I mean, even in cultural differences, like there's a film of his called Late Spring, in which Americans who write about it talk about this climactic shot, which is sort of like a great, see it as a
orange,
Zen moment, when they see a vase.
When he's peeling the orange right at the end.
No, this is not about peeling an orange. This is about a father and his daughter sleeping, and then
but like
lingers on
the movie, there's that really sad shot where he's like peeling the orange. He knows his daughter's going to marry the guy that looks like Gary Cooper.
Well, maybe, but what I'm talking about is a different shot, which is of a vase or a vase. And he said, when Japanese spectators look at this shot, they don't see a vase. They see a window, they see a plant, they see a vase too, but it's like they don't see it just as that, So it's like everything is kind of perceived differently through, because of the cultural differences. And I think that's really kind of interesting too. So it's like, and he also Hasumi is somebody who sees things in American cinema that nobody else sees. For example, he has a piece about John Ford, which is one of the most interesting pieces that anybody's ever written about John Ford. And it's all about people throwing things in John Ford films. And he goes through the whole career. I mean, the very last shot of the last John Ford film is Anne Bancroft, after drinking, like a pill that'll kill her, throwing the glass down. And, it's like, and he goes through Ford films talking about, and it's not capricious. He actually shows you what they have to do with the meaning of the films, And with Hawks, he talks about people being turned upside down, like one of the things that he's sort of like fascinated with in Hawks comedies. So he sees things that other people don't see. And he also is interesting because he was a person who was important enough to be the president. For 3 years, he was the president of Tokyo University. And many of his students have become famous directors. Kiyoshi Kurosawa is one of his students. A guy named Aoyama, who is other. There's several of his former students who become important directors too. So he's somebody, and I think as I say, we're at a great disadvantage because nobody's bothered to translate him into English, and he's done lots and lots of books, not only about film, he's also a literary critic. And he's almost completely, because you can find one chapter of his Ozu book in a book about Tokyo Story, which is called Clear Skies, which is also about the weather, the whole question of the weather and all of this.
And he doesn't speak any English, I'm guessing.
Oh no, he's very fluent in English.
Oh, maybe I got
to know him because he actually on some anniversary of, I can't remember if it was Ozu's birth or death or something, they had a big Ozu event in Japan, and first time I've been to Japan twice in successive years, but the first time because he invited me to be on a panel on Ozu, along with Ho Sha-shen, who was an interesting choice. And a couple of French critics too, actually. And so I got to hang out with him, but then I got really interested in his criticism. So I invited him to have a dialogue actually about Howard Hawks and a Japanese critic I was still interested in, named Masamura, who's become a very important cult figure in Japan in recent years, who's a really amazing figure. Anyway, so we had when he was president of Tokyo University, the second time I was on a Japan, the Japan Foundation gives fellowships to people if you can apply for them, and I was lucky enough to get one. So part of what I wanted to do was to actually to research Masamura, but also to have a dialogue with Hasumi about Howard Hawks and Masamura. Because what I was interested in finding out was what was Japanese about his interest in Howard Hawks, and what was American about my interest in Hashimura, which we didn't talk quite about that, but we did talk about, and that dialogue wound up in a book I co-edited with Adrian Martin, A Movie Mutations. So you can have a lot of his insights into Howard Hawks, because I also reproduced one of his essays about Howard Hawks in Movie Mutations. So you can read them there. And actually there have been other places that have published things by him, like for example, the online magazine, I can't remember if it's Lola Journal or Rouge, but if you Google his name, you could find a few pieces in English.
Yeah. I mean, if he has any interest in coming on the podcast, we'd love to have him. I probably have to do some reading.
I don't know. I haven't seen him, and he doesn't leave Japan now, and he's in his 80s now. So it's
okay. That might be a little difficult. But
so I don't know if how even though he's able to speak English, I don't know how practiced he is at it or how he would be. So but anyway, we've kind of had a loose friendship. We occasionally exchange emails, and he has a website in which I'm very proud that the piece I gave on Ozu for his panel is on his website, which is a piece called "Is Ozu Slow?", which I try to deal with the whole issue of people who say they have trouble with Ozu because they find his film slow. In which, in fact, that's because they haven't seen any of his silent films, which are very fast, actually.
Oh yeah, what was it? I Was Born But, and I mean, there's a lot of them, but I Was Born But I think is the easiest one to get. And
actually, I Was Born But is my favorite of all of his films in a lot of ways. Although I like some of the sound films too. I mean, it's hard to choose between them, really.
Yeah. So
I've always liked the gag in Stranger Than Paradise by Jim Jarmusch when he has various horses in a horse race named after different Ozu films. Like there's a horse called Passing Fancy, and there's one called, I can't remember what the other ones, but they're all named after Ozu films.
Yeah, I mean, I'm right near the Saratoga racetrack, and now that I'm trying to think through all the Ozu film titles I can think of, and they would all make great names of racehorses. I think, except maybe
Walk Carefully.
It was a flavor of rice over green tea. That might be a long name for a horse, but
that's a winner. I put my money on that one.
What's also funny about, I think I learned about the Japanese language, which is fascinating, is it's true of certain other languages too. There's no distinction made between singular and plural. This means that what we call Tokyo Story could just as well be Tokyo Stories.
Oh.
And what we call Late Spring could just as well be Late Springs. So in other words, there's really no difference between singular and plural. And just think of what that does to ideas of individuality, like a people, it has all kinds of ideological implications when you think about it.
Right. I mean, late spring sounds kind of like a manufacturing complication, but yeah. So
anyway, you can rethink a lot of titles, or they seem somewhat different if they think of if they're in the singular and you put them in plural, or if they're in the plural and you put them in singular.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a few. I guess the 47 Ronins doesn't sound great.
No, because sometimes the context, right. So that becomes the same. But for a lot of others, I don't know.
I'm trying to think.
An actor's revenge could be the revenge of actors.
Pastoral to Die in the Countries. Although I don't know if that's a literal translation, the Shuji Toriyama movie, but
yeah, sometimes of course the English titles are already different,
Hides and Seeks, Emperor's Tomato Ketchup. No, that sounds weird.
Yeah, of course. Well, of course, the context determines an awful lot, but even so, it's still becomes interesting when you think of, just for example, Tokyo Story becomes Tokyo Stories.
Right, that's the best one. And I'm just kind of falling on my face with these. But, Yeah, so I guess do you have any further thoughts on the Enchanted Desna?
Uh, Not really. I think it's, I guess well, I guess one thing that is a question, which is everybody has to decide for themselves, is how much political propaganda should or does play a role in how one receives the film.
Mm. Oh yeah, and
in some ways, I consider it extraneous, but it's not. Just because, in other words, it had to be there probably in order for the film to be made, doesn't mean that it necessarily becomes important part of the film.
Mm.
Because they're always, it's like in the same way. Well, but on the other hand, you see, one of the things that I found with Nicola's paper, in which he was comparing it to Malick, is that I like a lot some of Malick's films, but then when he made The New World, and he basically sees, he treats the whole massive genocide of the Indians, as a sweet little romance with John Smith and Pocahontas, then I somehow find it offensive, It's and I don't. He probably wasn't even thinking of it as propaganda. Who knows how he was thinking of it? But it nonetheless is a kind of way of, and it's also interesting that he probably wasn't required by his producers to make his vision propaganda in the way that Saint-Cyr was. But I'm guessing maybe I'm just being a cold warrior in sort of assuming that distinction. Maybe I'm just sounding like the usual biased American when I say this. There was so much that got poisoned in our thoughts by the Cold War, and we're still suffering from it. Because it seems to me, one of the things that drives me crazy is when you even had people I admired, like John McCain, talk about good guys and bad guys, and talking about people in Iraq as the good guys and the bad guys are people in Iran, and it's like that reduces the world to that of a Roy Rogers Western, which is not the way the world works, and it seems to me that Cold War thinking is what instills that, and we think that, particularly when I've argued that, like if a country is under occupation and military occupation by us, for that matter, the way anybody on any side of, whether they're Muslim or Christian or what kind of Muslim, or, it's like just to get through a day, you have to kind of like make peace with both sides. You have to live on both sides, in order to get through a day. So how do we sort of like work out who's a good guy or a bad guy according to that? What usually happens is we just decide everybody who sort of like says something nice about a bad guy is a bad guy themselves, and so deserve to be killed. And so we kill a lot of innocent people that way.
And actually, that kind of brings up another thing that struck me about your criticism when I first encountered it. I was encountering a lot of this stuff in like the mid 2000s when there was that huge rush of like torture porn movies that were extremely popular, like Saw, Hostel, and that kind of stuff. And I mean, I don't know if you were the first guy drawing this comparison, but your writing was the first place I saw the comparison drawn between that and the Abu Ghraib photos being released.
Yeah.
And so I'm kind of curious, what do you feel is the role of film in creating political consciousness? Like, you went into this a little bit when we went off on Star Wars for a bit, but
well, I think the main insight I got from living in Europe for almost 8 years is that nobody is apolitical. Whereas it seems to me that Americans tend to believe you can be apolitical. Whereas a European would say, or many Europeans would say, being apolitical means you're accepting the status quo and you're defending the status quo and you're promoting the status quo if you're not doing anything about it. So I think there's a tendency in America to kind of, it's funny, there are strategies. It's like a lot of what we consider apolitical tends to be right-wing very often in American society. rather than saying, but it seems to me that, I mean, obviously that's not to say that there aren't excesses and things that we can criticized about the left. I mean, and you know, I have a lot of objections to cancel culture, which is something that, and political correctness, which is tends to be more the property of the left than of the right. But I think it's.
I think the right's been doing pretty good with it the last few years. Like Colin Kaepernick kind of got screwed on that whole deal.
Well, I suppose, but I guess what happens is political correctness is really, to me, the last ditch attempts of defeated people. You know, when they can't get what they want politically, you know, that they can get somewhere, or compensations through political correctness. But it means that to be political, the minute you sort of like put a lot of value on political correctness, you're already defeated in a way.
So it's like valuing the image of some kind of power versus actual.
Right. But I mean, I find it extraordinary that, okay, Harvey Weinstein is in prison now and people kind of like have forgotten about him and all of this. But, you know, as far as his policy regarding, you know, what his profession was as a person who was distributing films, the New York Times was his biggest supporter. You know, it's like I've even argued that Janet Maslin's favorite film critic was Harvey Weinstein, because when she went to Cannes, her summary of the awards was Harvey Weinstein's comments about the awards, which when he denounced them because they didn't give any prizes to him. And she didn't even talk about the film. She just talked about his opinions, you know, which was, so the point, and the point is that also the New York Times is a corporate sponsor of Sundance, and Sundance, you know, in the mainstream mind is a big supporter of, you know, like independent cinema, but this is a joke because Sundance exists for the benefit of agents. And, you know, for somebody to make a big splash in Sundance means that you get picked up by a studio. And if you get picked up by a studio, you're not independent anymore. So it seems to me that Sundance was the enemy of being independent. And, you know, the very fact that Miramax and Harvey Weinstein, you know, was, you know, that Quentin Tarantino became the model of what an independent filmmaker is supposed to be, when in fact he doesn't have final cut on his films usually. So, I mean, the whole thing becomes a boondoggle.
Right. Yeah, there's sort of, there was a lot of concerted attempts, or at least it seems like this, looking at the fossil records, so to speak, from the 70s up to, I mean, I think at the present they kind of won, but to sort of keep pitching these $5 to $15 million movies as quote unquote independent movies, like Fox Searchlight and stuff like that. And I mean, I've had a lot of conversations with John Jost about this, because I don't think anybody's more bitter about that than John.
No, sure, he's very astute on that subject too. But I still think that what's alarming to me is that, you know, I was of the opinion that if Harvey Weinstein distributed a film by Jacques Demy or Jacques Tati, we had less chance of seeing it, or Kurosami, we had less chance of ever seeing it than if it had no distributor at all. Because he would get these things so other people wouldn't get them, and then he'd lock them up, you know, so they wouldn't be available. And this was supported not only by the New York Times, but by, you know, leading academics, theorists, you know, that I remember the late Thomas Alsasser, who was a major film scholar, at one point argued to me that, you know, I should be down on my knees in gratitude before Harvey Weinstein, because it was, you know, giving so much energy to art cinema, et cetera, you know.
Well,
people who respect power above everything else, you know. And the point is that even that Harvey Weinstein's gender crimes and sexual crimes were punished, but his artistic crimes were rewarded, and are still being rewarded. And that's what I find kind of creepy.
So he's got a vault full of films that haven't been distributed?
Well, he did.
Okay.
Because I mean, for example, the film of Kurosami. See, there was behind the scenes thing. A guy who's no longer alive, who was a very big mover and shaker behind the scenes, named a French guy named Pierre Ricien, who was a friend and supporter of Kurosami, really thought that it would be great if Miramax could, with their, could distribute one of his films. So he worked out a deal where the only way that Harvey Weinstein could get Muriel's Wedding, which was a big, crowd pleaser, was that he had to take Through the Olive Trees by Kiarostami as part of the same package. So what did Harvey Weinstein do? He picked it up and then he locked it away. You couldn't get it from him. If you'd call up and ask Miramax if you could book it, they'd say, what? We never heard of such a film, and things like that, It was like, and things that were done were, I don't know if it was because of the same deals, but I mean, he made it very hard to see The Young Girls of Rochefort. He wouldn't allow any ads, for example, when it showed in Chicago for that film. Jacques Tati's the color version of the Jour de Fête, he also handled and was also downgraded because of that. No, he put all his muscle behind stupid, adaptations of Henry James novels that made them into softcore porn. And these were actually films that were treated seriously by New York Review of Books. I mean, the point is that these had a lot of ramifications, this kind of control. It wasn't simply just what he was making available as a distributor. It was what he was making part of culture and what was being accepted by people as a legitimate part of culture. And so that it was legitimate to talk about a softcore porn version of Wings of the Dove, but it was not legitimate to talk about Jacques Tati or Jacques Demy, Mm-hmm. And that's because it's sort of like, I don't know, it seems to me that there's a lot of ways in which my most popular book, actually, even though it's a book that didn't even have an advertising budget, got 100 reviews or close to 100 reviews. And that's a book called Movie Wars, which the subtitle of which is How Hollywood and the Media Limit What Films We Can See. Mm-hmm. And so in a way, it hit a nerve when I wrote this, but then, and it was I'd written at a time when, Harvey Weinstein was kind of ruling American film culture. But I think it still tends to be true that there are certain ways in which the principles that Harvey Weinstein operated under are still in place, and being used by other distributors or producers or, whatever.
And so I'm guessing you don't see the move into these streaming platforms that seem to be fairly coagulated as a positive development overall for the cinema.
I don't see it as either. It's very hard for me because I don't know whether it's positive or negative. It's probably so many different things that it's like saying globalization is good or bad. You can't say it's either one. It's both. It's like it's a lot of different things. And the same thing with. I think it's good on the one hand that The Other Side of the Wind, Orson Welles' film, is still available on Netflix. But on the other hand, it's been totally marginalized and it hasn't been dealt with very seriously by critics. It's kind of significant that, for example, someone like Manohla Dargis, who will, call onto the carpet anybody who she thinks is sexist, will treat Oya Kodar, the co-writer of the film and the leading actress, as a piece of meat when she talks about it, and all of a sudden, she could just as well be a sexist pig when she's writing about this film. It's like, I think that a lot of people respect power more than they respect anything else. Mm-hmm. And I think that distorts a lot of the culture that we get as a consequence, because sometimes the most interesting culture is not from powerful people, and not from, Welles was a person whose ideas were powerful, but whose strength within the industry was almost non-existent. And that still is true. So how do we judge the fact that The Other Side of the Wind is available on Netflix, but at the same time, they won't bring it out on DVD. They recut things that they shouldn't have recut. So, for example, Welles' original edit of the sequence in the car in The Other Side of the Wind will become available, I think, on the DVD and Blu-ray whenever it comes out, but Netflix isn't ready to do that yet. So we're waiting for them. And maybe they'll never let a DVD come out, So how do we judge these things? It's like,
and I guess to tie into the earlier question about how film helps create political consciousness.
Yes.
You see, given the kind of dire elements of the current political situation, do you see any positive role that film can play in potentially resolving or at least like creating a mindset to resolve or at least deal with some of the major existential crises we're facing as a culture?
I would think so. I mean, a lot of people say film can't change anything, but I always like come back at them with, you ever see the film called Rosetta of the Dardenne brothers?
No.
Okay, Rosetta is actually my favorite of the Dardenne brothers. It's two Belgian brothers who make, and Rosetta is a film that got the top prize at Cannes the year it came out. The head of the jury was David Cronenberg, who's not known as a political person. But Rosetta actually created a law in Belgium called the Rosetta Law, which raised the minimum wage for teenagers. And it's called the Rosetta Law because it was the film inspired, because it's a film about the problem of a nearly starving teenager who goes to desperate lengths, to actually create, to get money for her screwed up mother and so on. It's like, it actually changed the law. But you couldn't even find that in the American press. That wasn't even considered a significant thing about it. But it seems to me, yes, films can change consciousness. And it seems to me, I always like to say that Playtime is a film that actually taught me how to live in cities. To live in, to process the overkill of, basically the sensory overload that one gets when one walks down the street. Playtime actually shows you how you could make something creative and playful out of it. And it made it possible for me to live with more pleasurably in cities. So I do think films, if we know how to use them, can teach us how to live, just like great literature can,
It's kind of funny you say that.
Other arts, painting, music, I think that that's to me part of what I love about Enchanted Desna. Enchanted Desna is a film that can teach us in some ways how to enjoy what we have,
Do you have any movies that you really enjoy that you also don't think are that good?
Sure.
Part two, can you name one of them?
But the trouble is that we're hung up on semantics now, because I always like to say, when you say good, you have to then say good for whom, good for what. You can't just say good by itself, because there's no such thing. So in a way, if a bad film is good or isn't good, the point is what do we mean by good? So, it's not good for getting an Oscar, but maybe it's good for something else,
So I guess what I think Ron was asking, I guess, is what is a film that is good for Jonathan Rosenbaum, but not good for much else?
Well, I don't know if a film that you're saying, a film that I like and nobody else likes? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I was mostly just teasing Ron, but
a movie that you might write about, and you might write about critically. So and you might pen it, but you still get a kick out of.
Well, I'm trying to think. It's funny. Sometimes I go through changes. Like, for example, I used to think that Showgirls, the Paul Verhoeven film, was a bad film. Now I think it's a good film. So the film didn't change. I'd changed. It's like, so what was then a bad film and now is a good film is just a change in me, So I don't know how meaningful that this question is, because it seems to me that it's to say that first of all, a film that's good one moment might be bad the next moment because your own situation and outlook has changed, So if I could come up with a title of a film that I liked and nobody else liked, I don't know if that's, I'm trying to think of.
Well, I guess to kind of go off what you were saying, like what, besides Showgirls, what would you say is like a movie where your perspective on it changed radically over time?
Well, okay, Ordette. Carl Dreyer's Ordette. The first time I saw it as a teenager at an interracial camp in Tennessee, I was infuriated by the film. I thought, this is a film that cheats. It's a religious film that pretends to be non-religious, I mean, atheistic. And it has nothing to do with the way I see it now. I didn't understand it. Because it seems to me what I didn't understand then was that Carl Dreyer's films are not about what one believes, but about challenges to belief. That if one is an atheist, this is a film that challenges that belief. And if one is a religious, then this is a film that challenges that belief too. It's like, and so it seems to me that that creates, it's like the best films are the most demanding and challenging films are ones that create or have to create new kinds of spectators in order to be understood. And so I don't know. I can't think of offhand of a film that I've liked and nobody else in the world has liked. Maybe there is such a film, but somebody would have to call it to my attention because I'm not aware of it right now. And it's hard to find any film. There are films that I think that are so bad nobody could possibly like, and then I find out that there are people who like it.
Oh, what's an example?
Lucky Lady.
Oh, I never. Okay, we got to watch.
Lisa Minnelli, Burt Reynolds, and Gene Hackman, directed by Stanley Donen in the mid '70s. Michael Wilmington, the critic, said his mother loved the film. Actually,
that's kind of a great.
No, but you see, that's an interesting boondoggle too, because that's a film that, in order for a lot of theaters in America to play it at all, they had to agree to play it for like 6 weeks or 2 months or something like that. So if you wanted to see a movie in a lot of small towns in America that summer, you had to go see that. There wasn't anything else playing. It was one of the top box office hits of the year because you couldn't see any other movie in a lot of these towns. So then they could turn around and say, see, we're just giving the people what they want. But that doesn't mean that people liked it. It was because they couldn't see any other movie in town and they wanted to see a movie. So, it just seems to me that so much of the way the industry works is self-fulfilling prophecies like that, So I think that the whole idea that, that we're giving the public what the public wants is usually a lie because nobody knows what the public wants. Not even the public knows what the public wants. And so even in terms of what people like or don't like, tastes change all the time, and what's disliked in one period can be liked in another, and vice versa. You go back to a lot of films that won Oscars, and you could be hard put to sort of figure out why anybody would have liked this film, much less great.
Yeah, early Oscar winners are pretty. It's rough going. There's a few good ones,
but people don't think of the Academy Awards as advertising, but that's what it is. It's taking products that are already popular and making them more popular, which is about the most useless thing that could be done. It's not about drawing our attention to things that we wouldn't have heard of otherwise in most cases. It's basically promoting what we've already heard about.
Titanic didn't need the extra help when it won.
No, I mean, I think it needed more help, like staying above the water. But
no, I mean, I'm not trying to say that good films never get Oscars, because I mean, like Moonlighting is a good case of something that actually a lot of people heard about it because it got an Oscar, and it was, good things happened because of that, And I guess when they gave the Oscar to Marty, that was not a film that would have necessarily been a big, box office hit too.
So there's occasional good, and for every once in a while you have like a Paul Haggis crash where.
The funny thing is, I liked that film when it came out. I probably wouldn't like it now. But, the other thing that happens is when you're reviewing films every week, you get pitifully grateful for, films that are halfway decent or somewhat interesting because there's so many bad things you see all the time.
I mean, how many films did you have to watch per week when you were?
It varied because originally I didn't have a second stringer. So it's like I had to see them all or nobody would see them, So I don't know, it varied, I can't remember, but I had to see a lot. And the point is, when you see a lot, you become, grateful for things that are halfway decent or for that, things that, that if you saw again, you probably wouldn't like. So it's it becomes very arbitrary in a way.
And so do you feel that's changed a lot since you left the Reader and you have kind of more space to choose your own what you want to
For
watch.
me, totally. I mean, I'm very if I start watching something on streaming, and it doesn't grab me, I can stop and go on to something else. Whereas when I was a reviewer, I had to stay to the end of everything, including things I hated. So it was like it's vastly different. So I have no regrets about leaving my job and retiring, because the reader didn't want me to retire. They wanted to keep me on, actually, at that point. But I'm actually glad I did, because I get to choose what I'm sort of like concentrate on in terms of what I write about too. And yeah, I'm not making as much money, but that's all right. I feel like I have enough money. So.
And I guess we should ask Vida. Is there anything you'd like to say? Because I know you've been kind of.
You look very pensive.
No,
I mean,
not to put you on the spot or anything, but
yeah. No, I mean, it was just really interesting hearing everything you had to say, because I didn't know that you were gonna cover that many topics. So for every topic, I had a thought, but now, yeah, at the moment, I can't think of one specific thing.
Are you based in Zagreb or in Split?
Yeah, in Zagreb.
Yeah, because some of the people who are, I should explain that the one way I kind of got to start teaching various things in Croatia was that I spent, actually one of the great experiences of my life was teaching at a place called Film Factory run by Belatar. And I was there for, it was a school for filmmakers, or he didn't even like to call it a school. He liked to call it a production, called it a factory. And each time I went, it was for 2 weeks, and I went 4 times, over 2 or 3 years. And the school sadly had to, lost its funding, so it doesn't exist anymore. But the woman who ran the office there runs a Kino club in Split. And I've taught various courses there, and other people who are affiliated with Film Factory have been affiliated with, this Kino club and done things there. So that's how I wound up, teaching there at different times. And this is actually the second time I've taught a film criticism workshop, but the first time was in person when I was there. And the one thing we did at the end was that we all wrote a single text together, collaborated, all the members, which was kind of tricky, but we managed to do it, and it got posted. A review of 8.5. So one thing that's going to happen at the end of this, I haven't mentioned this, but I can tell you, is that it's supposed to go public in some way. It'll be posted. The final text that's written, although how many texts that we're going to have, it's not clear to me either, because it's supposed to go, I think, until March 20th or something like that. I can't remember.
Oh, so there's going to be like a big composite review of Enchanted Desna going up on the website?
No, it won't be that. It'll be some other film that we're writing.
Oh, okay.
Actually, what I'm going to assign for next week is Rear Window. Go back to Hollywood, which I thought might be fun, because rather than something that nothing has been written about, to pick a film in which everybody has written about already. But I have to tell the others this, and I don't know if the others are going to turn in a review. I'm wondering, because everybody is kind of becoming later. Am I doing something to intimidate people from writing a review?
No, I was just thinking about it. I think this week, I really think that this movie was challenging. So maybe my theory is that it might be that, it's hard. I haven't spoken to other people, but maybe there is an element, of, at least from my position of, okay, now you have to write this review, and, obviously you are going to read it, is it good enough? What if I embarrass myself? So, and I think that pressure amps up when it's, arts movie. Well, this sort of, I mean, well, I guess
it does seem to me that what makes it more challenging in a lot of ways is that almost nobody has written about this film.
Yeah.
So in other words, if you're looking it up on the internet, that you can't compare yourself with other people. You have to sort of like, that was part of what I had in mind, actually, which made it harder for that reason. So it becomes much more challenging, because it's like being on a tightrope. You don't have any, without a net, because usually you could sort of say, well, I liked it, and this other person who reviewed it liked it, or didn't like it, or whatever.
Yeah. And it's also not a classical movie or like classical 3-act structure of Hollywood, so it's harder to find something to maybe ground the analysis in, or maybe it has to do with that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really hard, like when I was prepping for this episode, I felt like, I mean, luckily I had Jonathan here to do most of the talking, but but I kind of, I was very grateful that the film was brought to my attention. I really liked the film, but the best I could come up with is this is visually beautiful and like a bad one-liner about Mr. Ed.
And a bad what? I'm sorry?
A bad one-liner about Mr. Ed, the talking horse.
Oh, right.
Somehow I rolled with it, I guess. I don't know. But if I had to write a full-length review, I don't know what I would have done.
Yeah, I've never had to write a full-length review. I've written short things about it. Mm-hmm. I had to write, it's funny because on the basis of even seeing this film without subtitles and seeing a couple of other films in French, which I didn't understand that well, like with French, I had to write a 2-volume, was called A Critical Dictionary of the Cinema that Richard Roud edited in the 70s and came out in 1980. So I had to write, like for an encyclopedia, the entry on Sensiba, which it kind of was ridiculous. It's just that that's how sort of neglected she was, that they had to pick me to write about it, even though I didn't know anything. So it's like, and you see, that's in a way what creates the David Thompsons of the world. It's sort of like there's nobody who could write about it. So they pick anybody, and so anybody can become an expert. Because there's
nobody. You're not just anybody.
Well, but at the same time, I don't know Russian. I don't know. There's so much that I don't know about Sontsiva and about Dovzhenko's life and so on. That, yeah, I mean, I've become really interested. So I've gone to the trouble of learning what I can. But the point is that I haven't learned enough to be what, by normal terms, in most cases, most films would be an expert on them. I'm more expert than other people, but that doesn't make me an expert, so to speak, just because I know a little more. And I only know a little more because there's only a little that's information that's available, at least on the internet.
Well, it seems like you'd have to hire somebody in the Ukraine to write that and kind of do it right.
Well, and most of the things that I've, in other words, you could, what is kind of amazing, there are things that are out there in the world that you can sort of like are amazing resources, but we don't know how to use them yet. Mm-hmm. For instance, there's a Russian website, which is almost the precise equivalent of YouTube in Russian. And it's called OK.ru, very simple. And it's amazing how many American films you can get good prints of. You can get some French films with English subtitles there that you can't get anywhere else. Mm-hmm. Like one of Bresson's films, Gentle Creature, for example, you can't see, as far as I know, you can't get a good print of that anywhere else with English subtitles. But most people don't even know about it. And I just learned about it recently. Mm. And all of a sudden, you can find out an incredible amount because you can actually, it's not the easiest website to use in the world, but you can sort of figure it out and use the search engine the way that you use YouTube. And even on YouTube, there's all kinds of things you can come up with. Mm. I think what's kind of like disconcerting about film culture now is that, suddenly an infinite amount of stuff has become available. Mm. But it's more than people know what to do with or how to navigate or how to make choices. So in a lot of cases, it makes people more conservative than they were before. So there are a lot of people who will only see, films that are box office champs or get the Oscar or, that everybody winds up seeing Mank, just because that's, even more than they would have before. Even if nobody likes it, everybody winds up seeing these few films because it's too hard to make a choice among all the things that are available. So that's why lists are so popular nowadays.
Right.
And because it's sort of like if you don't have an agenda when you go to YouTube or OK.ru, you're lost. You have to have an agenda of things that you're looking for. Mm-hmm. But it becomes really important to have an agenda, I think.
Oh yeah, I mean, if you don't have the like when I used to go onto YouTube without like a list of or some idea of what I was looking for,
Yeah.
I'd always end up watching like security camera footage of people fighting in a Denny's. Right?
Right.
I don't know why, but like that's what left to my own devices. That is apparently my true nature in terms of video consumption. But uh, thankfully there's a lot of lists now, so I was able to watch better stuff than that.
Well, and I think the point is that people have to start learning how to create their own agendas. It's a very important thing. And it seems to me that criticism plays a very big role in this, it seems to me. Because it seems to me that critics can lead the way for about helping you determine what it is that you want to see.
Right.
And you start with one film that you like and you want to see more like it. That's one way to go, in terms of agenda. Other films by that filmmaker, other films with that actor, you could start doing it that way. But there are lots of different ways, it's like, it's just that you have to be creative and want to learn more. And because that's the thing is that they compared with, this is why, you see, what I find kind of amazing is when I was getting interested in film as an art form in my 20s, I lived in New York and then in Paris and then in London, 3 great cities for seeing a lot of films. And yet there are people in their 20s now who know much more about film and have seen more film than I possibly could have in my 20s. Mm-hmm. And that's because of the different situation, because of the internet, And it's like, so it's like this bounty that suddenly exists, but people don't know how to deal with it. And in learning how to deal with it, it seems to me could be a lifelong occupation, actually, in certain ways, because there's so many possibilities there. And possibilities not just about aesthetics, but about politics too. People haven't learned how to use the internet politically in the way that they could. The right has learned, but not the left, I think. The right has somehow probably dealt more effectively. I don't know, Trump and his Twitters, or whatever,
Well, I mean, it seems like the kind of like the Eric Fromm Escape from Freedom idea where there is this like huge inherent decision anxiety. And so you're going to go back to like the
tried and true,
giving the most obvious, or not most obvious, but like the most forceful and most kind of like chewed up and digested answers so that you don't have to worry about this, horrible anxiety of like everything's at my fingertips. What if
the funny thing about this though is that we have to get rid of this anxiety because there's nobody looking over our shoulder. It's like nobody's going to judge us if we make the wrong choice, except unless we're just being merciless on ourselves. It's like it seems to me that we really have to learn to enjoy ourselves on.
Well, I think at least with like younger people, there's a lot of kind of people socialize through like I guess attachments to certain media.
Yeah.
And so there is a lot of pressure to like I was sick of talking about Harry Potter films like 10 years ago, but I'm gonna have to keep, if I want to socialize with other people in their early 30s, I'm probably going to have another few hundred conversations about Harry Potter.
Right. I understand that because
off the island.
I mean, I get on the average about 1,000 people a day going to my website. And that's a lot because it's people around the world. I mean, and it's including, people I'll never meet and I don't know. But lately, for example, one of my books got translated into Chinese. And as a consequence, I get a lot of people from China now reading me. It's really strange. And I don't know why they're reading me or how well their English is. And, even what they're choosing to read is sometimes bewildering to me. But it's still kind of interesting because I think that I find that that I'm more a member of a community now than I was when I was writing for many, many more people and I was writing for the Chicago Reader because it's more concentrated what I'm writing about in a sense. And people, in other words, I know that people are interested in, because I can even track on Google Analytics which pieces of mine they're reading, and so in a certain kind of way, I feel it becomes a more interactive community, even though people can't post on my site. They can make comments on Facebook or Twitter, you know. Mm-hmm. But I do feel it's like more interactive in a certain way. So it's manageable. Whereas if somehow it seems to me if I were writing for a mainstream publication, I wouldn't be able to manage it. Mm-hmm. And I'd be alienated more than feel like I was a member of a community. Because as I say, with the one time I wrote for the New York Times, I've got more hate mail than any other time I got in my life, actually.
Oh, so you weren't getting a lot of hate mail at the Reader?
Not that much, some. I mean, I was getting maybe an equal mix of hate mail and people who liked me, whereas the Times, it was mainly hate mail.
Oh. I wonder how it is for like regular Times columnists, if it's still mostly hate mail.
I don't know, but I do notice that when people become more popular, they also become more hated. That seems to happen that's part of celebrity culture.
Right.
Once somebody becomes a celebrity, there are more people who hate them. and it's all about the power game, you know. It's sort of like you know, you envy of somebody for being a celebrity, but you also, I don't know, it's obviously a complicated mix, but it does seem to me that there are a lot of downsides to being a celebrity. So I can be glad that I'm not a celebrity, at least in the way that mainstream critics are.
Well, you're a celebrity on the Anomaly podcast.
Okay, thank you. Well, maybe that's a good closing note.
Okay. Yeah, I guess, does anybody have any final thoughts?
Come on, Vita, one more thing. Isn't that why you're here?
Speak now or forever hold your peace.
Yeah. There's the unanswered question.
I think what should come next from her is a review. she should log off and write a review.
Yeah, right.
Okay, cool.
Well, I think just by being on here, she earned 100% in the assignment. So
yeah, that's my secret plan.
Well, Jonathan, I think that Dan's one unanswered question or unasked question is, which is your favorite Harry Potter movie? But we can skip over that one.
I don't remember which ones I've seen, so I couldn't answer the question.
The last one, because it was over. No. So this has been Anomaly Questionable Movies, and today we've had Jonathan Rosenbaum of the Chicago Reader, written a lot of books, done a lot of stuff. Vita Zelic, who is up and comer, and I'm still Dan.
And I'm still Ron.
And we'll see you at the movies.
All right. Take care, everyone. And thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on. Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you.